Spanish to English.
Ricardo?
Okay. Perfect.
So we should have the introduction in English.
Yeah.
Then someone from the Ministry of Energy will have a few words. Then the presentation will be in English, and then the Q&A will be back and forth.
Sure. Do you mind if I just kick it off here real quick, Ricardo?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anthony Armley. I am the International Partnerships Manager at the National Energy Technology Laboratory based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was part of the delegation that visited Chile back in April. And as part of the follow-on effort, we agreed to put together a series of Energy 101 informational webinars to help inform the citizens of Tocopilla on energy transition topics. Today's topic will be clean hydrogen. Some of you may refer to it as green hydrogen, and we will cover that today. The speakers are from a company in New Mexico called Tallgrass, and the speakers are Justin Campbell and Brett Hooton. Justin is the Vice President of Power and Transmission. Brett is the Senior Director, again with Power and Transmission. Purpose of today's webinar is to inform you more about what green hydrogen or clean hydrogen is, why it's important, potential for jobs in that sector, training that might be needed or skills that you would need to obtain, health impacts, long-term projection of uses of hydrogen, and much more. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. So if you have questions, please save them for towards the end, and our speakers would be glad to help answer what they can. I appreciate you joining us today. This will be recorded so that we can save it for a future resource for those interested that were not able to make it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I've had some trouble, but I think I've got it all set.
Carolina, ¿quieres dar algunas palabras de introducción?
Perfecto, sí. Hola a todos, todas, muy buenos días. Muchas gracias por sumarse hoy a este taller sobre hidrógeno verde. Para empezar, no sé si todos hay traducción simultánea, entonces para poder escuchar en español tienen que pinchar un botón que dice español-inglés y pinchar español para que todos puedan ir entendiendo muy bien el contenido de este taller. Y bueno, en nombre también de la Seremi de Energía y del Ministerio de Energía les damos la bienvenida y esperamos que esta sesión sea muy provechosa. Estemos muy atentos y al final de la sesión hay un espacio para hacer preguntas. Así es que le doy la palabra a los conferencistas.
Thank you very much, Minister. Anthony, would you like me to begin our part of the presentation?
Yes, please feel free, Justin and Brett. Go ahead.
Excellent. Perhaps the first place to start is a little bit of background on who we are and who our company is. Tallgrass Energy is an energy infrastructure company focused primarily on the energy transition and infrastructure to support decarbonization. That includes hydrogen production, storage, transportation, and use. And so we'll talk a bit about that today. So you know who Brett and I are. We're responsible for the power aspects of that business, and that includes production of hydrogen from renewable energy. It includes power generation and also electric transmission and some other sectors as well. So pleased to be here. Thank you for the time, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. I'm not sure who has the slides, but if we could go to slide 3, that's probably the best place to start. 5, yeah, 5 on that deck. Thank you. At the highest level, the way we see this and the way we see our role is as follows. The energy transition is underway. It has been for some time. I spent a fair share of my career in California, which 20 years ago started to deploy wind and solar resources on the power grid, and that has accelerated over time. As we look at the energy sector today, that continues. There continue to be changes in the way energy is produced, in the way it's distributed, and the way it's used. That includes, of course, renewable power generation, but it also includes things like alternative fuels, including hydrogen. There are many impacts of this, of course. Some of those relate to jobs, and transition in what's available for people in terms of employment. We see that in the different areas where we work, including New Mexico, and we'll talk a little bit about that project throughout the course of today's discussion. With that change, there's opportunity. There's opportunity to build more renewables, to participate in electrification, for our company to provide alternative fuels and capture wasted resources and reuse those for energy in support of the economy, and comes with all of that greenhouse gas reductions. So that's really the focus of our business, is finding projects where we can use our expertise to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote affordability of electricity, reliability of energy supply, and other aspects that are important to the local and national economy in places where we work. One theme in our business, we try to find places where we can reuse existing infrastructure. We think that's a good way to pursue different aspects of the energy transition. We'll talk about this later. One project we have is to convert a coal power plant to use clean hydrogen as fuel. So instead of burning coal, and instead of having the particulate and greenhouse gas emissions that come with coal, we're instead going to produce and use hydrogen as fuel at that power plant. That's the Escalante power plant. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So the theme here, the energy transition is underway. We are going to see continued changes in the way energy is produced, distributed, and used. Hydrogen has a lot to do with that. And we, Tallgrass, as a company, have a particular focus on repurposing existing infrastructure in the context of the energy transition. So Sarah, can we go to the next slide? Let's talk briefly about hydrogen itself, which is a key component of our business and what we're doing, and a key component of the energy transition. So at the highest level, hydrogen is, of course, a very common substance, and it can be used to store energy, much like fuels we use today, whether that's natural gas or other fuels, aviation fuel, gasoline, diesel, those sorts of things. Traditionally, hydrogen is produced from natural gas and results in carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. There's quite a bit of hydrogen produced today, mostly for use in agriculture, in fertilizers, and to produce ammonia and its derivatives. And so today, that's how it's produced. Looking ahead to the energy transition, you can produce hydrogen in a few different ways that result in very low or no greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what we're working on right now, developing projects that will produce hydrogen in those ways. One way, and I'm on the fourth bullet on the slide here, one way to produce clean hydrogen is by using renewable energy and water. If you put that water through a process called electrolysis, you can separate it into oxygen and hydrogen. And so that's one way to produce hydrogen with no greenhouse gas emissions. There's another way that's what is sometimes called green hydrogen. You can also produce clean hydrogen from natural gas. This is very similar to the way hydrogen is produced today, with one exception. Instead of venting the carbon dioxide, you can capture it and permanently sequester that carbon dioxide underground permanently. We're working on that as well. That depends on having geology that can support that kind of sequestration, but that is an emerging area and one that we have great confidence in. So those are really the two clean ways to produce hydrogen. There are some derivatives of those, for example, using nuclear power instead of renewables. It's a little bit different, but the chemical process works the same. All of those result in a clean hydrogen that can be useful for decarbonizing things like long-haul trucking, steel manufacturing, mobility in warehouses, which basically just means forklifts, and other devices that are used in those warehouses. And we think there's also a role for decarbonized hydrogen, clean hydrogen in power production as well. And we'll talk about one example of that in a minute. When it comes to hydrogen in power plants, if we think about the power grid and what we're observing here, the first step in decarbonizing the power grid is to add renewables, to add solar and wind. And that's those resources are generally very available, generally very low cost relative to alternatives. As you progress, at a certain point, it gets more difficult to keep the power grid reliable. And that's simply because solar resources only produce sometimes, wind resources only produce sometimes. So you have to have other types of energy storage and dispatchable power to account for the moments in time when you don't have enough solar and wind resource to keep the grid reliable. We think hydrogen has a role to play in providing that firm resource to the power system. So it's a fuel source that is both decarbonized if produced in the right way and available when you need it. We'll talk about the Escalante project here in a few minutes. It's really the marquee example of what I'm talking about, where you'll have hydrogen fuel available and the power plant available when needed as a complement to renewable resources in a decarbonized future. Okay, so Sarah, let's turn to the next slide and let me spend a few minutes on the hydrogen value chain. So we've talked about a few ways hydrogen is produced, a few ways it can be used, and some considerations here. The image on the screen, and I apologize, it's in English, but I'll try to point to the different places and describe it just in case that's helpful. If you think about the value chain, we're seeing progress really across all aspects of this right now. In the United States, driven largely by the Inflation Reduction Act and other incentives. So if you look at the left side of the page, at the top left, you see a wind turbine and some solar panels there. That represents electrolysis. And so the way this works is you can use renewable resources when they're producing. Power an electrolyzer, which is just a piece of equipment that creates voltage across water and separates the hydrogen from the oxygen. So you can produce hydrogen as long as you have water and renewables. You can produce hydrogen in this method, and that is carbon zero, greenhouse gas zero hydrogen. The trick here is how you manage the electrolysis powered by resources that are intermittent. So there's a lot of work going on in the technology, the electrolysis technology, to handle renewable resources, sometimes producing at their maximum output and sometimes not. The more you can, the more hydrogen you can get out for each, kilowatt hour of input, the lower the cost of hydrogen. The more frequently you can run the electrolysis, the lower the cost of hydrogen. So as we look at the market, we're seeing a big focus on driving down the cost of hydrogen through technology development and through commercial and financial innovation to try to minimize the cost of that fuel. So that's green hydrogen and how that's produced. The other thing that we're working on is production of hydrogen from natural gas at very low greenhouse gas levels. And so the way I think about this, and it's a simplification, but it's the way that I think about it. Natural gas is carbon and hydrogen. That's the molecule is 1 carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms. Essentially what you're doing when you produce clean hydrogen from natural gas is you're taking that natural gas out of the ground, you're breaking it into its carbon and hydrogen components, and then you're putting the carbon essentially right back where it came from, and it stays there permanently. In the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for permitting carbon sequestration projects like this. And in the permits that we're seeking, we're required to prove that those formations will hold that carbon permanently and to monitor that for decades into the future to ensure that's what happens. So the result is, because you've taken that natural gas out of the ground and essentially put the carbon back where it came from, now you have hydrogen with very, very low greenhouse gas emissions. It's not quite zero because inevitably these chemical processes have some inefficiencies, but it's far lower carbon intensity and greenhouse gas intensity than the traditional way of making hydrogen. Here, what we're seeing in industry and in the market is a real focus on the industrial equipment that does that. There are different technologies here as well, some that seem to achieve a much higher carbon capture than others. And of course, that's, the business considerations are similar. Folks are trying to drive the cost of hydrogen down, drive the level of carbon capture up, and take those technologies to market at scale. So as we look at this page and think about the value chain, those are really the two primary ways of producing clean hydrogen. If we look then to the top left, which you see in purple and red, there is also work going on how you store and distribute hydrogen for use in different industries. If you think about the natural gas pipeline system, at least here in the United States, we have a very integrated system. It's very easy to move natural gas around as a fuel source. That doesn't yet exist for hydrogen. But folks, our company included, are working on ways to do that at low cost. One example is to take the hydrogen that you've produced, decarbonized clean hydrogen, and to combine that with nitrogen and make ammonia. That's a relatively stable molecule that's relatively easy to transport. So you can move that via pipelines. There are ammonia pipelines that exist today, and you can put that on ships. And so companies like ours are thinking about things like, if there's demand for hydrogen in different places, whether that's Asia or South America or the Middle East or wherever it may be, we're working on taking that clean hydrogen, attaching it to a nitrogen atom to make ammonia, and then moving that essentially as a transportation mechanism. One way we think of it, and hopefully this translates well, is the nitrogen is a suitcase for the hydrogen. So that's something that's going on. There are other things people are thinking about in terms of hydrogen distribution, including liquefying it, moving it on trucks. Our view is it's challenging to get that to global scale, but certainly a lot of work going on in the storage and transportation aspect of the value chain. The last thing I'll hit here before we move on is the bottom right-hand side of the page, which you see marked in yellow. This is the end use. So what does all this get used for? Again, here, lots of technological innovation going on, lots of excitement about this. There are many different applications for clean hydrogen. One we'll talk about in a minute is as fuel for a power plant that complements renewable resources, but there are other applications as well. Things like, you can take that hydrogen and combine it with biogenic CO2, which is essentially CO2 from biological processes, and make things like sustainable aviation fuel. So Tallgrass has entered into a joint venture with United Airlines to do that, so that instead of using aviation fuel that has a greenhouse gas emission component, they're going to start using greenhouse gas free aviation fuel and begin to decarbonize aviation that way. There are other applications like steel manufacturing, like heating, like long haul trucking. It turns out it's very difficult to have long haul trucking that's efficient.
Sí, bueno, porque aquí hay una clave. Vamos a estar aquí con esto.
Long haul trucking is difficult to decarbonize using just electric vehicles. Hydrogen seems to provide an alternative that lets long haul trucks decarbonize. There are also industrial applications. Hydrogen is used in all sorts of processes, manufacturing of fertilizer, steel, sources of heat, and things like that. So you can think about taking that hydrogen and using it for those applications as well. So in summary, across the value chain, there are a few different ways you can make hydrogen. You can make it clean hydrogen. You can make it from renewables. You need water and renewable resources. You can also make it from natural gas as long as you're capturing enough of the CO2 to make it decarbonized. And a lot of work's going into that. There's a lot of work going into the midstream, whether that's in pipelines via ammonia or otherwise, and then lots of development downstream for how the hydrogen can be used to decarbonize. Perfect, Sarah, thank you. I did want to show, when we think about electrolysis and green hydrogen, just a very brief note on this so you understand how it works. If you focus on there's a box in the middle labeled electrolyzer. Essentially, the way an electrolyzer works is by having a cathode and an anode and applying a voltage to those. And what that does is it causes the water to separate into oxygen and hydrogen. And so the result of that is if you can apply renewable energy to create that voltage, you can get decarbonized hydrogen. You also happen to get oxygen, which has other industrial uses as a byproduct of this process. Sarah, let's move perhaps to the next one. This is a rather detailed diagram of how clean hydrogen production from natural gas works. And the thing I would focus on here, there's the third box in the middle row that's labeled autothermal reactor, is the core of this equipment. Essentially what happens there is heat and steam are brought into a pressure chamber, and there's a chemical reaction that results in a high pressure stream of very pure carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. Because it's high pressure and because there aren't any impurities in that stream, it's very easy to separate out the carbon dioxide and the carbon monoxide from the hydrogen. And so you can take that hydrogen as a very high, a stream with a high degree of purity and use that. You can then take the high purity stream of CO2, compress that, transport it, and permanently sequester it. So the key in this process is that autothermal reactor and the chemical reaction happening under conditions that allow a very pure stream of syngas and separation of that CO2 off of the stream there. So, okay, let's transition to the next one here, and I'll try to go a little bit quickly. I know we're limited for time. I wanted to discuss or describe to you our Escalante power plant project. So the picture you see here is a power plant in New Mexico, in Pruitt, New Mexico, in McKinley County. It operated for many years as a coal-fired power plant. 3 years ago, the company that owns that plant decided to shut it down. And so now the plant is idle. The coal stack is gone, and it will not operate again as a coal-fired power plant. Typically, and in other cases in this region, typically what happens after a plant like this is shut down is eventually it's demolished. I think that's a shame in many cases because there is this power plant in particular is very well maintained and could continue to produce power. What we're doing instead of demolishing the plant is converting the plant to use hydrogen as fuel. So Sarah, perhaps you can point to the building with the taller building. I don't know if you know where the boiler is there, but if you have your pointer, it's the third from the left. Yep, that building right there. The boiler is in that building. And what that does is it takes steam and heats it up so that steam can go run a turbine and the generator. We are removing the equipment from that boiler that, essentially injected coal to fuel it, and we're replacing it with hydrogen burner tips. So instead of injecting coal into that burner, we'll inject hydrogen. Everything else will work the same. And what that means is once we're complete, the local area, this part of New Mexico, and really the southwestern United States as a whole, will have access to a greenhouse gas free resource as a complement to the renewable generation in the area. So at times when solar power is producing a lot of energy, this power plant will not be producing as much. And then at times when solar can't produce, we expect this power plant to ramp up to provide decarbonized power to the system during those hours. So that's what we're doing here. We will also establish on-site hydrogen production. So we'll use hydrogen from natural gas. We will take the carbon and sequester it. We have on the page here greater than 97% carbon capture and sequestration, which means some of the cleanest, lowest greenhouse gas hydrogen you can make. And we'll use that as fuel. A few things I'll highlight that are important to us. One, up front, I mentioned that as the energy transition progresses, there's likely to be a change in what jobs are available and needed. Here, we're fortunate because the people that used to operate this power plant, many of them are still in the region. They have the skills they need. And so we expect this to create many new local jobs, even on the heels of retirement of a coal power plant. So, typically the story is a coal power plant will retire and those jobs are lost. But by repurposing this facility, we can preserve and create new jobs as part of the energy transition in that local community. So that's an important thing to us. The other thing, and then I'll stop here perhaps, but because we will establish clean hydrogen production on site. And because we only need that hydrogen for the power plant sometimes, it creates an opportunity to use that hydrogen for other applications. So right now we're in discussions with a company that will take that excess hydrogen and liquefy it and use it as fuel for trucking. We're also in discussions with folks on blending that hydrogen into existing chemical processes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other things like using it as fuel for forklifts in an industrial park that's planned for the site. So because we have this power plant and because it only needs hydrogen sometimes, that establishes a base of production that's useful for other applications as well. And we're very excited about that also. So perhaps maybe Sarah, let's roll to the last slide and I'll just highlight some of the benefits of repurposing existing infrastructure and Escalante in particular. The first is it supports the continuing energy transition because of the very high level of carbon capture. This is a very low carbon resource. And because of the way the power plant operates, instead of it complements and allows further deployment of renewable resources like solar and wind. The second thing I'll highlight is, again, having this base of hydrogen production, we see as important to allowing other uses on site, like mobility and industrial uses. So that's another benefit here. I mentioned up front, affordability and reliability of power are things that we think about a lot. This is, and I'll try not to burrow into the electrical engineering, but the more renewables you deploy on an electric system, the less able you are to count on those renewables for capacity when it's needed. So this is a very low cost source of capacity to the grid to preserve reliability and to preserve affordability. So you could think of this as equivalent to, this is a 265 megawatt plant. And depending on how you measure, when it comes to reliability, it's probably the equivalent of 1,500 megawatts of solar in today's world. So we see great benefits. We're very excited about this project for a lot of reasons, and I look forward to further discussion. So Brett, is there anything you'd like to add before we turn to questions and answers?
No, I don't have anything. Looking forward to hearing the questions.
I think we have a raised hand from Carolina. Go ahead.
La presentación, se me cayó un rato la conexión, entonces puede ser que lo dijiste, pero no me quedó muy claro si esa planta que era de carbón ahora la ocupan para producir hidrógeno, para que este hidrógeno sirva de combustible en otras aplicaciones, o es que si ocupan el hidrógeno para generar energía. No me quedó muy claro, y cómo generan el hidrógeno. Si podrías, por favor, profundizar en eso. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for the question. Escalante is a power plant, and so it produces energy, produces electricity. Up until 2020, it used coal as its fuel, and it produced a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas, carbon included, carbon dioxide included. It also emitted particulate matter, like any coal plant. What we'll do is we'll continue to use the power plant to make electricity, but instead of coal, we'll use clean hydrogen. We're going to make the hydrogen from natural gas. So as it turns out, that part of New Mexico has very attractive geological formations for storing CO2 underground permanently. The site we're looking at, subject to check. I think it's about 2,000 feet under the surface where there's a formation that's very attractive for sequestering the carbon. So what we'll do is we'll take natural gas and using a process called autothermal reforming, we'll split that natural gas into CO2 and hydrogen. The hydrogen will be fuel for the power plant. The CO2 will then be captured using a process called an amine reaction. It's a very old technology that captures very, very high levels of CO2. And then we'll transport that CO2 via pipeline to a site about 70 miles away, inject it into the geology, and it will stay there permanently. And that's the reason the hydrogen fuel is very low greenhouse gas.
I think as well, Justin, it's important to add that while that's what we're doing at Escalante, with other projects, we are looking at renewable-based hydrogen as well. And so we're really playing in both spaces on that. Hydrogen in both.
Correct. Brett's right. I'll give you another example. There are several. Well, close by, I'll say, I can't say exactly where, we are working on a project that would make 1 gigawatt of electrolysis, which would be the largest in the United States, one of the largest in the world. Our plan is to get up to 5 gigawatts. We're looking at applications of that hydrogen, including taking it and combining it with carbon to make things like sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, and other decarbonized fuels. So we're working on both kinds of hydrogen production.
We have a couple of hands raised. Before we go to the both hands, which I'm seeing, we also have a question here. Could you tell us the way in which the personnel from the previous carbon fossil fuel power plant were incorporated into, or are going to be incorporated into this new power plant? Was there a selection process? Is there or will be there a capacity building requirement? And also, what percentage of the personnel approximately will have a job on the power plant?
That's a good question. So a few different pieces there. So we haven't made any final selections yet, although there are people that still work at the power plant maintaining it while we move through our process to develop the project. We expect more than 60 jobs at the power plant itself. Those jobs will be largely similar to what they were before. And that's because the only thing that's changing with the power plant is the fuel in the boiler. So the way the turbine operates, the way the generator operates, the transformers, the connections to the grid, the control room, almost entirely, will be exactly the same. So the skill sets that those folks had before translate directly to the power plant operations. What will be different is essentially the fuel injection system. So there'll be some training that we need to do around that, although the skill set that those folks have, will translate to that as well. So the power plant, largely the same kinds of jobs. We haven't made any final selections. Our preference would be to work with people from that area. The hydrogen plant itself is new. That's a different but similar skill set. So we have and are making plans for how to work with local universities and others to make sure we can implement training and provide those jobs, especially to people in the area. So the power plant jobs, very similar because much of that equipment will operate as it did before. There is a new piece of equipment in this hydrogen production plant that will require some training. we expect to work with the local community, local universities, and others to help train those workers. I should say also, something else that's very important to us as a company is indigenous jobs in the region. There are several tribal groups in this part of New Mexico, the Navajo, for example. There's another example to the west of where Escalante is. There was a power plant called the Navajo Generating Station. It was a coal-fired power plant that provided power to Los Angeles. That plant was shut down and it was demolished. And a lot of native jobs were lost. A lot of indigenous people lost their jobs, and the Navajo Nation lost a significant source of revenue that went to things like the local community. So that's the example we're trying to avoid by repurposing Escalante and working with local communities, the Navajo and others included, to preserve those jobs.
Thank you, Justin. We have three hands raised. First, Carolina Matei, then Keith, and then Ivan Ramirez. Carolina?
Well, hello, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It's been very enlightening and interesting. And also congratulations on the work you're doing, particularly on Escalante. And I would like to ask you if there are any legal or regulatory pressing issues in the US that you are facing regarding this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, Carolina. That's an interesting question. Oh gosh. One thing that's very important to us is the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides incentives for projects like this. So there's, I don't know how familiar folks are, but this legislative package provides incentives for clean hydrogen production, carbon sequestration, the production of decarbonized power, and a host of other things. So perhaps the most important policy and legal question on my mind is how that law gets turned into, regulations and specific requirements around how you access those credits. One thing that is interesting there, and it's a detail, but it is on my mind, companies like ours can take those incentives as a tax credit, but others, like, for example, the Jicarilla Apache Nation or the Navajo Nation or nonprofits, we can transfer those tax credits to those organizations, and they can take a direct payment from the federal government. And so that's very new. Folks are still figuring out how that's going to work, but it's on my mind as a sort of legal and regulatory question as to how we can maximize the value of those to make sure the power is affordable as possible and perhaps drive some benefit into those local communities. If I'm candid, water is a big deal. The power plant Escalante itself has all the water rights it needs to operate. But as we think about, very large scale green hydrogen production, blue hydrogen as well requires water. And the Western United States is in a drought, and water rights are very contentious. So, there are legal questions there, as to who has the rights to water and what that can be used for. There are questions, frankly, there's some technical questions around using, sources of water, non-potable sources of water, and those aspects. So, to answer your question, the tax credits are a big legal question for us that we're working on, and how that sorts out. Water is something that's always on our mind as well.
Thank you, Justin.
Very much for your question, for your answer. Thank you.
And thank you, Carolina. Next is Keith, and then Ivan Ramirez. Keith?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Keith.
Hi, great presentation, and actually Carolina asked part of my question, but I'll ask three related questions. One is, what sort of program or systematic structure or strategy is in place for stakeholder engagement with the community to keep people informed and involved, if you will, in this process, and to answer any questions they have? That's the first question is how you're doing that. Second question is, what are the primary environmental concerns that you've heard or that are raised by the community related to this
Yeah.
project? And the third question is, do you have an estimated timeline for when? I might have missed it, but when do you hope to see this thing actually started to operate? Thank you so much. Again, a great presentation.
Those are great questions, Keith. Thank you. In terms of timeline, what we're thinking is 2028 in service is what we're targeting. That is driven primarily by the need to permit the carbon sequestration with the Environmental Protection Agency. So we are planning to seek what's called a Class 6 permit, which requires permanent sequestration of that carbon. That's different than, say, a class, I think I may get the number wrong because we don't do this, but a Class 3 permit where you can use CO2 to increase oil production in a field. That's not what we're doing. We're doing something different. That Class 6 permit process is very rigorous and takes some time. So 2028 is when we're planning to be in service. That schedule is largely driven by the need to permit the carbon sequestration piece of the project. Your question on environmental concerns is a great one, and I appreciate that one. I'll tell you something that we try not to do when we can avoid it. We try not to talk about hydrogen production using the colors. Green hydrogen is shorthand for renewable based hydrogen, blue for natural gas based, pink for nuclear power based, and so on. And the reason we try to avoid that is some folks, and I understand why, are concerned that blue hydrogen production may not be the right thing to do. And I understand that. The reality is some kinds of blue hydrogen production do not help us make progress on decarbonization. Other kinds do. So there's a very, very wide range of carbon intensity coming from carbon intensity based on the process you're using. So the process we're using at Escalante is one thing. We've seen other blue hydrogen processes that emit 8, 9, 10 times more greenhouse gases. And those don't seem like the best idea, at least to me. So we hear an environmental concern that sort of paints with a very broad brush and says any hydrogen from natural gas is bad. But I think that oversimplifies it. And I think that you really have to look at the specifics of the chemical process, at how gas transportation is procured, at how carbon sequestration is handled, and you have to measure the carbon intensity of the hydrogen production specific to projects to really get an understanding as to whether we're making progress or not against greenhouse gases. So fortunately, what we're doing at Escalante calls for and requires a very high level of capture and thus produces a very, very low greenhouse gas hydrogen and thus a very low greenhouse gas power. I'd add one more thing on that because this is sort of near and dear to my heart, I suppose. The task to decarbonize is big. We're really, at least from my perspective, having spent 20 years in the power business, we're really just now getting to the part where the technical challenges are getting weighty. It's one thing to turn California's electric system to be 30%, 40%, 50% renewable energy. Turns out you can operate a system like that without a whole lot of changes. Once we start to press beyond that, and once we start to look at things like how do you decarbonize aviation? How do you decarbonize cement manufacturing? How do you decarbonize, shipping across the oceans? Those are much more challenging problems. And to get to the kind of scale we need to get to, you can't do it without blue hydrogen, at least not in my view. Green is critical, but it uses a lot of water and it uses a lot of land. And unfortunately, the best renewable resources are where there's no water. And so it's good, and we're going to do a ton of that. That is a big priority for us. But I think we have to have an all hands on deck approach to this if we're really going to decarbonize like we need to. And so what that means is we have to take a sophisticated look at, blue hydrogen production that maybe doesn't help us make progress, and contrast that against what we're doing at Escalante, which has a very, very high carbon capture sequestration rate, and therefore very low carbon intensity score. So I love the question, because the pushback we get sometimes, or the concern we get is, well, blue hydrogen, that's based on natural gas, therefore it's bad. And I think we've got to be a lot more detailed in our look and our consideration and how we solve some of these very challenging problems. So that's what I'd say. Your first question, I think, was about stakeholder engagement, something else that's very important to us, and we could perhaps add more detail on exactly what we're going to do. What I can tell you is the Escalante project was included in one of the hydrogen hub proposals. Let me take a step back. The federal government here asked for states, industry, and academia to make proposals to build hydrogen hubs. Escalante was included in one of those. That's going very well. With that, we were required to produce a plan for how we're going to engage the local communities. And so we've got a way we're going to go about that includes tribal interests, local stakeholders. Of course, we're already very involved with the local politicians and communities and economic development organizations, and making sure we're hearing some of the concerns, because we want to be sensitive to those up front. I'll give you an example. For years, there was uranium mining in this area. And for whatever reason, the companies that were doing that were not very good environmental stewards. And there's still a lot of understandable hard feelings about that. We've made sure to hear those concerns very early in the process, so that as we start to develop and make our plans, we're engaged with those folks and understanding what's on their mind. So something that's so I thank you for the question, Keith. I hope I've answered it for you.
Thank you, Justin. We have Ivan Ramirez, and then we have a question from the chat. Ivan.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes, Justin. Mi pregunta tiene que ver precisamente con el tema de la captura de carbono. Tanto en el caso de Escalante o en otras plantas, ¿nos podrías comentar respecto de los métodos o tecnologías para hacer la captura de carbono? Y si acaso hay investigaciones o estudios que permitan ver posibilidades de reducir el secuestro de carbono bajo tierra. Eso, muchas gracias.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ivan. That's a great question. The short answer is yes. There's a tremendous amount of research and experience with carbon capture, in particular. So the process that we'll use is an amine reaction. Essentially, there's an amine solution that you push the syngas through, and that has the effect of capturing the carbon. And that process itself can get higher than 99% capture out of that stream. That's a process that's been around for decades on end and is very well established. Similarly, moving CO2 in a pipeline is established technology. And what we'll do is essentially compress it through a well into a formation that can hold it. And so the question then with the formation has to do with the nature of the different formations, good cap rock. Really, it's all the kinds of things that oil and gas companies have thought about for 100 years when it comes to identifying attractive places to extract hydrocarbons. All that science and expertise applies here. And so we're able to use that, as well as, frankly, in New Mexico, we're able to use data that's been generated in all that oil and gas exploration to inform our decisions about where to drill test wells and confirm our understanding of that geology. So the capture technology itself is well established. In our case, we expect to use an amine reaction that's been around for decades. Similarly, while carbon sequestration and capture has not happened like it needs to at scale, the geological understanding gives us a high degree of certainty there. One thing I would point out, so of course, there are many carbon capture and sequestration projects that have underperformed, that have made big promises and not been able to quite achieve what they've said. In our review of all of that, those processes are post-combustion carbon capture, where you have some sort of combustion process and you end up with flue gas that has all sorts of impurities in it. And then you try to capture the carbon out of that. We're doing something different because we're using an autothermal reformer and getting a very, very pure syngas stream that's really just hydrogen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and maybe a little bit of water, but the water is very easy to take out. Because there are no impurities in that stream, you can achieve a much higher level of capture. So that's the key distinction. So short answer is these are fairly well-established technologies. And so we have a high degree of certainty, especially because we're capturing this in a way that's different than's been tried before, at a different step in the process.
Thank you, Justin. And we have Andrea. I think we can finish with that, Andrea.
Hola, buenas tardes. Sí, quiero hacer una consulta. Recién mencionaste algo en el enfoque de la reconversión de las plantas. Quisiera saber cuáles son los principales equipos o infraestructura que necesita modificarse y cuánto tiempo más o menos te demoras en una reconversión de una planta antigua al uso de hidrógeno.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The power plant itself, there's very little work that has to happen to repurpose it. So in the boiler is maybe 13 stories tall, and at the bottom it has these machines that grind up coal and spray it into the boiler and it burns, and that's how the heat is generated for the process. So we won't use those anymore, and instead we'll install essentially tubes with a tip on them to spray hydrogen into the boiler. And it's actually kind of neat. It creates this sort of flame tornado almost. There's a whole science around how that happens. It's very interesting. That's all the work that has to happen at the power plant, which we don't expect will take very long once we're in construction, maybe 6 months or so. The thing that takes more time is building the hydrogen production facility itself. That's probably, depending on how you measure, that's probably about 2 years of time to build that. It's a relatively complicated piece of machinery. They exist all over the world, so they're not new technology. It just takes time for all the metallurgy and piping and control systems and all that work. The reason it will take us, 5 years or so from today to a point where we have the plant in service really has to do with the permitting aspect of the project. We need to make sure we have the permit and have done all the work to make sure the carbon sequestration will work properly. But the construction on the plant, relatively straightforward. The construction of the hydrogen production unit takes longer, but established technology.
Thank you, Justin. And with that, I think we are out of time. I would like to ask either Eileen or Andrea or someone from the Ministry of Energy in Chile to please close the session today. Eileen, I don't know if you want to be the
No,
person in charge. I know Carolina is already gone from the meeting, or perhaps Andrea, if Eileen is unavailable.
voy a, sí, voy a cerrar yo. Carolina se tuvo que retirar. Yo agradezco la instancia, creo que es una excelente opción, es una buena partida de este grupo de talleres que vamos a tener para la comunidad o para quien quiera unirse. Les agradezco mucho a todas por el tiempo para dedicarse a nosotros y preparar esta presentación para que nosotros nos acerquemos cada vez más a esta nueva industria que en nuestro país se está desarrollando o quiere desarrollarse debido a las capacidades que nosotros sobre todo tenemos en el impulso o del uso de nuestros recursos renovables. Así que nada más que agradecerle el tiempo a todas, la oportunidad con el Chego y la participación de todos y sobre todo la inquietud a través de las preguntas realizadas y, y gracias por respondernos con la experiencia que tienen a través de sus plantas. Eso.
Muchísimas gracias, Andrea. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos y esperamos verlos el próximo seminario la semana entrante.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you
Thanks,
for
Brett.
having
Thanks,
us.
Sarah.
Bye, everyone. Adios.
Take care.
Bye.